When we set up that opposition that I was talking about, with down one side, we have light and all of the ideas associated with it, light, civilization, the spark of the sacred fire. On the other side is darkness and savagery, and here Africa. It's quite clear that the opposition here falls with civilization being the superior. If you look at the passage that we have right here, this is the one we ended up with last time, where Marlow's aunt tells him that he was something like an emissary light, something like a lower sort of apostle, and that she says that the goal of civilization is to wean those ignorant millions from their horrid ways. So this is the notion of civilization that Marlow is confronting. We have this dualistic opposition between light and darkness set up. I really wish we had time to look at pages 82 and 83, because this is Marlow describing his journey around the coast of Africa till he got to the outer station. And the main thing that comes from this is the notion of the surrealness of it. When he's talking about the Africans, he says they wanted no excuse for being there. They were great comfort. For a time, I would feel like I belonged still to a world of straightforward facts. But the Europeans need an excuse to be here, and that excuse is civilization. He lands at the outer station. So we're at the bottom of page 83. The outer station would be a coastal place where the company has its offices. So he's gone around the outside of the coast of Africa and landed at the station, and then he has a 200-mile trip to get to the central station, which is where he meets the manager. He's walking to the offices. He says, "A horn to the right, and I saw the black people run. A heavy and dull detonation shook the ground. A puff of smoke came out of the cliff, and that was all. No change appeared on the face of the rock." They were building a railway. The cliff was not in the way or anything, but this objectless blasting was all the work going on. A slight clinking behind me made me turn my head. 6 black men advanced in a file, toiling up a path. They walked erect and slow, balancing small baskets of earth on their heads, and the clink kept time with their footsteps. Black rags were wound around their loins, and the short ends behind waggled to and fro like tails. I could see every rib. The joints of their limbs were like knots in a rope. Each had an iron collar on his neck, and all were connected together with a chain whose bight swung between them, rhythmically clinking. Another report from the cliff made me think suddenly of that ship of war I had seen firing into a continent, and he's remembering earlier he had seen a ship engaging in a war with savages, shooting shells just into Africa like it was trying to sink the continent. And this is the same sort of silly activity. He says, "It was the same kind of ominous voice, but these men could by no stretch of the imagination be called enemies. They were called criminals, and the outraged law, like the bursting shells, had come to them, an insoluble mystery from the sea. All their meager breasts panted together, the violently dilated nostrils quivered, the eyes stared stonily uphill. They passed me within 6 inches without a glance, with that complete death-like indifference of unhappy savages. Behind this raw matter, one of the reclaimed, the product of the new forces at work, strolled despondently, carrying a rifle by its middle. He had a uniform jacket with one button off, and seeing a white man on the path, hoisted his weapon to his shoulder with alacrity. This was simple prudence, despite being so much alike at a distance he could not tell who I might be." Okay, so we've got 3 groups of people here. In the previous passage, we have the renegade Africans who are refusing to bow and who are being attacked by the French frigate. Here we have the criminals, and we have one of the reclaimed. Okay, so what are the 3 options if you're an African facing civilization? You could be a slave, right? They were the criminals who were chained together working. You can be a rebel, which means you fight back in the war. The other one is, of course, becoming a collaborator, one of the reclaimed, because the guy who's standing there in the uniform holding a rifle is African also, but he has become a collaborator, working with the European forces. So you can surrender, you can be captured, you could be an enemy, and then the last group, Marlow keeps going and he sees a group of people under the trees. Another mine on the cliff went off, followed by a slight shudder of the soil under my feet. The work was going on, the work. And this is the place where some of the helpers had withdrawn to die. They were dying slowly, it was very clear. They were not enemies, they were not criminals. They were nothing earthly now, nothing but black shadows of disease and starvation, lying confusedly in the greenish gloom. Your options are fight back, be captured, cooperate, or die. Those are your options that these people face. He walks over to some buildings and meets the accountant. And on page 85, we get our description of the accountant. I didn't want any more loitering in the shade, and I made haste toward the station. When near the buildings, I met a white man in such an unexpected elegance of get-up that in the first moment I took him for a sort of vision. I saw a high starched collar, white cuffs, a light alpaca jacket, snowy trousers, a clear necktie, and varnished boots. No hat. Hair parted, brushed, oiled, under a green blind parasol held in a big white hand. He was amazing. He had a pen holder in his ear. I shook hands with this miracle, and I learned he was the company's chief accountant, and that all of the bookkeeping was done at the station. He had come out for a moment, he said, to get a breath of fresh air. The expression sounded wonderfully odd with its suggestion of sedentary desk life. I wouldn't have mentioned the fellow to you at all, only it was from his lips that I first heard the name of the man who was so indissolubly connected with the memories of that time. Who would that man be? It's Kurtz. The accountant's the first one who mentions Kurtz to him. Moreover, I respected the fellow. Yes, I respected his collars, his vast cuffs, his brushed hair. His appearance was certainly that of a hairdresser's dummy, but in the great demoralization of the land, he kept up his appearance. That's backbone. His starched collars and got-up shirt fronts were achievements of character. He had been out nearly 3 years, and later I could not help asking him how he managed to sport such linen. The accountant is very well dressed. He's wearing clean white clothes. Marlow will say, even slightly scented. So he's clean and well dressed and oiled and brushed. Why does Marlow respect him? In the great demoralization of the land, he kept up his appearance. He looks like civilization. He's wearing nice clothes and he smells good out in the great demoralization of the land. I mean, he's in this super hot, horribly humid, very sweaty, dirty climate, and he managed to keep white clothes clean. Wearing white clothes just around normally, they get all brushed with dirt and stuff like that. And he's out here. That's backbone. Now, Marlow is being somewhat sarcastic because I don't think he truly respects him, talking about the fact that he's able to maintain the facade of civilization even in the face of the great demoralization of the land. How does he do that? I could not help asking him how he managed to sport such linen. He had just the faintest blush and said modestly, I've been teaching one of the native women about the station. It was difficult. She had a distaste for the work. Thus the man had verily accomplished something, and he was devoted to his books, which are in apple pie order. How does he manage to maintain his perfect civilized appearance? He does it by making an African keep his clothes clean for him, even though she doesn't want to. She had a distaste for the work. So he's managing to maintain the appearance of civilization by oppressing the Africans. I mean, I think this is sort of an image of how it works. This is the bottom of page 85. It was hot in there too, so he's in the office with the accountant. Big flies buzzed fiendishly and did not sting, but stabbed. I sat generally on the floor, while of faultless appearance, even slightly scented, perching on his high stool, he wrote. Sometimes he stood up for exercise. When a truckle bed with a sick man, some invalided agent from up country, was put in there, he exhibited gentle annoyance. The groans of this sick person, he said, distract my attention, and without that it's extremely difficult to guard against clerical errors in this climate. What does that suggest about the accountant? How does he manage to maintain his books in apple pie order? This guy is literally dying. He crossed the room gently to look at the sick man, and returning said to me, he does not hear. What, dead, I asked? He startled. No, not yet, he answered with great composure. So this guy's literally dying in his office, and he's, excuse me, I'm trying to work here. Could you die more quietly, please? You're really being quite annoying. In order to maintain his function with the company, he has to oppress the Africans and sacrifice his humanity. At this particular point, then, he goes and does his 200-mile tramp to the central station, and in it he sees all sorts of disturbing kinds of things. He says something when he remembers the doctor saying it would be interesting for science to watch the mental changes of individuals on the spot. I felt I was becoming scientifically interesting because he's starting to feel crazy. He gets to the central station now where he meets the manager.
The accountant showed us
what's necessary to maintain this successful enterprise in Africa. The first thing you need to do is you need to oppress the Africans, and then you need to sacrifice your humanity. Now we meet the manager. So each one of the characters he meets gets more and more ominous. My first interview with the manager was curious. He did not ask me to sit down after my 20-mile walk that morning. He was commonplace in complexion, in features, in manners, and in voice. He was of middle size of an ordinary build. His eyes, of the usual blue, were perhaps remarkably cold, and he could certainly make his glance fall on one as trenchant and heavy as an axe. But even at these times, the rest of his person seemed to disclaim the intention. Otherwise, there was only an indefinable, faint expression of his lips, something stealthy, smile, not a smile. I remember it, I can't explain, it was unconscious the smile was, though just after he had said something, it got intensified for an instant. It came at the end of his speeches like a seal applied on the words to make the meaning of the commonest phrase appear absolutely inscrutable. He was a common trader from his youth employed up in these parts, nothing more. He was obeyed, yet he inspired neither love nor fear, nor even respect. He inspired uneasiness. That was it. Uneasiness. Not a definite mistrust, just uneasiness, nothing more. You have no idea how effective such a faculty can be. He had no genius for organizing, for initiative, for order even. That was evident in such things as the deplorable state of the station. He had no learning and no intelligence. His position had come to him. Why? Perhaps because he was never ill. He had served 3 terms of 3 years out there, because triumphant health and the general rout of constitutions is a kind of power in itself. When he went home on leave, he rioted on a large scale, pompously, Jack ashore, with a difference in externals only. This one could gather from his casual talk. He originated nothing. He kept the routine going, that's all. But he was great. He was great by this little thing that was impossible to tell which could control such a man. He never gave that secret away. Perhaps there was nothing within him. Such a suspicion made one pause, for out there were no external checks. Once when various tropical diseases had laid low almost every agent at the station, he was heard to say, men who come out here should have no entrails. He sealed the utterance with that smile of his, as though it had been a door opening into a darkness he had in his keeping. He fancied you had seen things, but the seal was on. The manager is completely incompetent as a manager. The station is in horrible shape. Nothing is working like it's supposed to. He's not very smart. He had no learning and no intelligence. He's average in appearance. He's a middle size and ordinary build. His eyes are the usual blue. So he's average, except that he's incompetent as a manager. So why does he have power? How does his ability to inspire uneasiness give him power? He says, out here, there are no external checks. There's nothing to stop him from doing it. But he also says, the other side of that is perhaps there was nothing within him. If he has no conscience and there's nothing outside of him to stop him, he can basically do anything he wants. He will say at the beginning of the next volume, his uncle will say, anything can be done here. Anything you understand. When they're talking about a problem with a trader who we later meet, he's the Harlequin, and they say, get him hanged. Why not? Anything can be done here. So if you are dealing with someone who has no conscience, basically a sociopath, and there's no police around to stop him, he can do anything he wants. There's nothing to stop them, and if there's nothing outside of them to stop them, then they can basically do anything. But he inspires uneasiness. If he inspired active fear, then you could get away from him. You could just say, no, I'm not dealing with you, and leave. But he inspires uneasiness, and that's what allows him to keep control. Now, the reason that this becomes important is because he prefigures Kurtz. We are about to start meeting Kurtz, and we are told that Kurtz has no restraint. No restraint. And if you have no restraint and there's nothing to stop you, then basically you can do anything you want. And the problem is Kurtz has no restraint, and so he has nothing to stop him in the gratification of his various lusts, as Marlow tells us. So we're now going to start meeting Kurtz. Page 91. So he goes to see the brickmaker of the station, and in the brickmaker's office, he notices a painting. Then I noticed a small sketch in oils. Panel representing a woman draped and blindfolded, carrying a lighted torch. The background was somber, almost black. The movement of the woman was stately, and the effect of the torchlight on the face was sinister. And obviously this is a symbolic representation of civilization carrying the torch of civilization out into the darkness of savage Africa. And this is the notion that the ant represents. Notice it's a woman. She's blindfolded because, as Marlow had said before, if the women are blind, they must be blind. And so she's blinded. It turns out that Mr. Kurtz had painted this painting by himself, and Marlow asks him, tell me, pray, who is this Mr. Kurtz? And the agent says, the chief of the interstation, he answered in a short tone, looking away. Much obliged, I said, laughing. You're the brickmaker of the central station. Everyone knows that. He was silent for a while. And then he says, he is a prodigy, he said at last. He is an emissary of pity, of science, and progress, and devil knows what else. And then he begins to quote Kurtz. We want, he began to declaim suddenly, for the guidance of the cause entrusted to us by Europe, to, so to speak, higher intelligence, wide sympathies, a singleness of purpose. Who says that, I asked. Lots of them, you replied. Some even write that, and so he comes here, a special being, as you ought to know. Why ought I to know? I interrupted, really surprised. He paid no attention. Because the same people who sent him specially also recommended you. So Marlow and Kurtz have been recommended by the same people, both by the people back in Europe. So what does Kurtz represent here? He's an emissary of pity and science and progress, and devil knows what else. Kurtz is here for civilization. He's an emissary of pity and science and progress. He has painted this painting of civilized people carrying the torch of civilization in. We're going to be seeing the contrast between the ideal of civilization and the reality of Africa develop in parallel. Before we keep going, I want to look at page 92 really quickly and point out that Marlow keeps reminding us that what he is building toward in this novel is not Kurtz's death, but his encounter with the intended at the end. And he says, I would not have gone so far as to fight for Kurtz, but I went near enough into a lie. You know, I hate, detest, can't bear a lie, not because I'm straighter than the rest of us, but because it simply appalls me. There's a taint of death, a flavor of mortality in lies, which is exactly what I hate and detest in the world, what I want to forget. It makes me miserable and sick, like biting something rotten would do. So the lie is the lie he tells to the intended at the end. Keep that in mind, because that's the big moment, is when he finally turns around and the intended says, tell me, what were his last words? What were Kurtz's last words? And Marlow lies to her. Let's skip ahead. Marlow is lying on the deck of the boat, which is against the shore, and they are walking along the dock or the shore below the boat, the river boat. And so he's lying on the deck, so he's above their heads. They're right below him, so they don't know he's there, and they're talking about Kurtz. He has asked the administration to be sent there, said the other, with the idea of showing what he could do, and I was instructed accordingly. Look at the influence the man must have. Is it not frightful? So right away, they're afraid of Kurtz because they believe Kurtz has influence, and the manager believes that Kurtz is aiming for his job. The manager believes that Kurtz wants to take his job away.
In the midst of this conversation between the manager and his uncle, the manager describes to his uncle Kurtz's behavior in a way that captures Marlow's fascination because Kurtz does not behave the way one would expect a civilized man to behave. They're talking about Kurtz delivering ivory back to the central station. The other explained that it had come with a fleet of canoes in charge of an English half-caste clerk Kurtz had with him, that Kurtz had apparently intended to return himself, the station being by that time bare of goods and stores, but after coming 300 miles had suddenly decided to go back, which he started to do alone in a small dugout with 4 paddlers, leaving the half-caste to continue down the river with the ivory. The 2 fellows there seemed astounded at anybody attempting such a thing. They were at loss for an adequate motive. As for me, I seemed to see Kurtz for the first time. It was a distinct glimpse. The dugout, 4 paddling savages, and the lone white man turning his back suddenly on the headquarters, on relief, on thoughts of home perhaps, setting his face towards the depths of the wilderness, towards his empty and desolate station. I did not know the motive.
Okay, so why is it such a big deal in this particular passage to Marlow that Kurtz decides to go back upriver? Here's the situation. He's come 300 miles downriver, so he's about 500 miles inland in Africa, and the only way to travel is by canoe. And it takes a long time to go 300 miles in a canoe. Kurtz has been 300 miles upriver. His station is empty of stores. He has no food. And he's coming down the river with the ice collected, which is how he's going to make all his money. And suddenly, after going 300 miles, he turns around and goes back. Instead of turning his back on thoughts of home, he turns and goes back to the wilderness. That is incomprehensible. You're almost home, and you turn around and go back to a place that's dark and savage. For Marlow, this makes Kurtz really interesting. On the next page, I just want to call your attention to the passage where the uncle tells the manager, "Ah, my boy, trust to this. I say, trust to this." I saw him extend his short flipper of an arm for a gesture that took in the forest, the creek, the mud, the river. seemed to beckon with a dishonoring flourish before the sunlit face of the land, a treacherous appeal to the lurking death, to the hidden evil, to the profound darkness of its heart. So the manager is appealing to the darkness. So this is one of the things that Kurtz and the manager have in common. They both want to use the darkness of Africa. But the manager has one difference. As Marlow will tell us later, the manager does have restraint. And the manager's restraint is that he wants to keep up appearances. The problem with Kurtz is that Kurtz has no restraint.
On page 99, Marlow starts his journey into the heart of darkness. But it's not just a journey inward geographically, it's also a journey inward psychologically, as he approaches the darkness inside of Kurtz and inside himself.
They're going up the river. So they're now on the riverboat. They're heading up the river, heading toward Kurtz in the inner station. And he says, the earth seemed unearthly. We are accustomed to look upon the shackled form of a conquered monster, but there you could look on a thing monstrous and free. It was unearthly, and the men were, no, they were not inhuman. Well, that was the worst of it. The suspicion of their not being inhuman. It would come slowly to one. Okay, so he says, we are accustomed to look upon the shackled form of a conquered monster. So what's the shackled form of a conquered monster? What's he talking about? What would nature look like to someone from England, for instance? You've seen those English pictures of the English landscape, like Surrey, the parts of England that's all little farms and villages and stuff, and they have hedgerows and stone fences dividing up the landscape. So the nature has been basically conquered there, right? The land has all been cultivated and the trees have been moved around and replanted and everything's under control. But of course in Africa, it's a thing monstrous and free. And he says it was unearthly and the men were, and he stops. No, they were not inhuman. So he was about to say it was unearthly and the men were inhuman, but then he stops and says they were not inhuman. It would come slowly to one. They howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces, but what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity, like yours, the thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar. And then someone on the boat says, ugly, and he repeats it. Ugly? Yes, it was ugly enough. But if you were man enough, you would admit to yourself that there was in you just the faintest trace of response, the terrible frankness of that noise, a dim suspicion of there being a meaning in it which you so remote from the night of the first ages, could comprehend. And why not? The mind of man is capable of anything, because everything is in it, all of the past as well as all the future. What was there after all? Joy, fear, sorrow, devotion, valor, rage, who can tell? But truth stripped of its cloak of time. Let the fool gape and shudder, the man knows he can look without a wink. But he must be at least as much of a man as these on the shore. He must meet that truth with his own inborn true stuff, with his own inborn strength. Principles? Principles won't do. Acquisitions, clothes, petty rags that would fly off at the first good shake. No, you want a deliberate belief. An appeal to me in this fiendish row? Okay, so when he says you want a deliberate belief, what does he mean? How do you avoid the attraction of the savagery of Africa? Remember the beginning when he was describing England in Roman times. At the end of that description, he says, what redeems it is the idea only, an idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea, and an unselfish belief in the idea, something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. And here he's talking about you want a deliberate belief. So what's the deliberate belief? Right, I mean, it's civilization. You have to believe in civilization. You have to believe in what you're doing, and you have to hold true to that belief. Because he says you need a capacity for faithfulness. What Marlow tells us, a capacity for faithfulness, which means faith to the deliberate belief of civilization. So when you're confronted with the lack of civilization in Africa, the only way that you can avoid the attraction of Africa is to maintain capacity for faithfulness and a deliberate belief. Now, in order to maintain that capacity for faithfulness, one of the things you want is restraint. Restraint is the ability, by the way, this is something that connects us with Jane Eyre, because it's very much about restraint, about controlling herself. And Marlow is talking about restraint. And it would be wonderful if we had time to go through this passage, but we don't. But he's looking at the Africans who are cannibals, And he's wondering why these Africans who are not getting any food, they're being paid in copper wire, which they can't eat, and they're not being allowed to stop and use the copper wire to trade for food. So they have no food. And he's wondering why the Africans don't just eat the Europeans, because they're stronger than the Europeans. There's more of them. The Europeans, I mean, he looks around and he says, well, geez, at least I hope I don't look as unappetizing as the others. This, by the way, is page 103. So he's looking around and he says, at the bottom, he's looking at the Africans and he says, restraint. What possible restraint? Was it superstition, disgust, patience, fear, or some kind of primitive honor? No fear can stand up to hunger. No patience can wear it out. Disgust simply does not exist where hunger is. And as to superstition, beliefs, what you may call principles, they are less than chaff in a breeze. Don't you know the devilry of lingering starvation, its exasperating torment, its black thoughts, its somber and brooding philosophy? It takes a man all his inborn strength to fight hunger properly. It's really easier to face bereavement, dishonor, and the perdition of one's soul than this kind of prolonged hunger. Sad but true. And no earthly reason for any kind of scruple. Restraint. I would just as soon have expected restraint from a hyena prowling amongst the corpses of a battlefield. But there was the fact facing me, the fact dazzling to be seen like foam on the depths of the sea, like a ripple in the unfathomable enigma. A mystery greater when I thought of it than the curious, inexplicable note of desperate grief and the savage clangor which had swept up by us on the riverbank behind the blind whiteness of the fog. So why is he making such a big deal about the Africans' restraint and not eating the Europeans even though they're hungry? Keep that question in mind, because the question of restraint is really important. And by the way, here's the passage I was just talking about. The manager is talking and he says, Marlow says, he was the kind of man who would wish to preserve appearances. That was his restraint. So even the manager has something restraining him, which is the desire to keep up appearances. Let's get down there to page 108. Marlow is talking about seeing Kurtz. I laid the ghost of his gifts at last with a lie. He began suddenly. Girl, what did I mention? A girl? Oh, she is out of it completely. They, the women, I mean, are out of it. Should be out of it. We must help them to stay in that beautiful world of their own, lest ours gets worse. So there's that passage about the women again. The aunt, and now the girl is the intended he's talking about, and the lie is the lie he tells her at the end of the novel. And now he's going to start telling us why he tells her a lie. And he starts talking about Kurtz, because he lies to her about Kurtz, and he's going to tell her why. You should have heard the disinterred body of Mr. Kurtz saying, my intended. You would have perceived directly how completely she was out of it. And the lofty frontal bone of Mr. Kurtz. They say the hair grows on going sometimes, that is, after death. But this specimen was impressively bald. The wilderness had patted it on the head. And behold, it was like a ball, an ivory ball. And we're back up at the top of this page. It had caressed him, and lo, he had withered. It had taken him, loved him, embraced him, got into his veins, consumed his flesh, and sealed his soul to its own by the inconceivable ceremonies of some devilish initiation. He was a spoiled and pampered favorite. My ivory, oh yes, I heard him, my intended, my ivory, my station, my river, my everything belonged to him. It made me hold my breath in expectation of hearing the wilderness burst into a prodigious peal of laughter that would shake the fixed stars in their places. Everything belonged to him, but that was a trifle. The thing was to know what he belonged to, how many powers of darkness claimed him for their own. That was the reflection that made you creepy all over. That may be the first time in English literature that the word creepy appears, by the way. It was impossible. It was not good for one either, trying to imagine. He had taken a high seat among the devils of the land. I mean, literally. You can't understand, how could you, with solid pavement under your feet, surrounded by kind neighbors ready to cheer you or fall on you, stepping delicately between the butcher and the policeman, in the holy terror, scandal, and gallows of lunatic asylums. How can you imagine what the particular region of the first ages a man's untrammeled feet may take him into by the way of solitude? Utter solitude without a policeman, by the way of silence, utter silence where no warning voice of a kind neighbor can be heard whispering of public opinion. These little things make all the great difference. When they are gone, you must fall back upon your own innate strength, upon your own capacity for faithfulness. Okay, so why is Marlow telling these people, or talking to these people about the kind neighbors ready to cheer you or fall on you? Stepping delicately between the butcher and the policeman, the holy terror, scandal, and gallows of lunatic. What do those things represent? Remember the panopticon and the notion that you control yourself because there are all these people around you watching you all the time? So it represents all of the levels of social authority. The butcher is the guy next door. The policeman is the guy who can arrest you. This is how civilization controls its members. by the warning voice of a kind neighbor whispering of public opinion. Those are the things that keep us under control. What happens when those things are taken away? What do you rely on? You have to rely upon your own capacity for faithfulness, a deliberate belief. So when you're outside of society, when there's nothing to control you, where there are no external checks, as Marlow tells us over and over, you have to rely on those things. What happens if you have no capacity for faithfulness? What happens if you have no restraint? Now, my example for this, about this capacity for faithfulness, so let's imagine this scenario. You are out in the Mojave Desert, and you are driving at 3 o'clock in the morning, and it's pitch black, and it's perfectly flat, and you can see for miles in every direction, and you come to an intersection, and there are no cars in sight. You can see everything. There are no cars in sight. You come to an intersection, there's a stop sign. Do you stop? I would stop anyway. I would stop, look both ways, and then go. Because I have, I hope, a capacity for faithfulness. I hope I have the restraint that even if there's no one there to see me, I would still obey the law. That would be the capacity for faithfulness. If there's no one around to stop you, do you still obey the law?
That willingness or ability to obey the law, even in the absence of external controls, is the way that the capacity for faithfulness functions as a form of restraint.
Kurtz represents European civilization, but the problem is that he apparently has no, Marlow will tell us later, he has no restraint. Marlow says at the bottom of the page, the original Kurtz had been educated partly in England, and as he was good enough to say to himself, his sympathies were in the right place. His mother was half English, his father half French. All Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz. And by I learned that most appropriately, the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs, the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs, there's the Society of Civilization, had entrusted him with the making of a report for its future guidance. And he had written it too. I've seen it. I've read it. It was eloquent, vibrating with eloquence, but too high-strung, I think. 17 pages of close writing he had found time for. But this must have been before his, let us say, nerves went wrong and caused him to preside at certain midnight dances ending with unspeakable rites, which, as far as I reluctantly gathered from what I heard at various times, were offered up to him, do you understand, to Mr. Kurtz himself. But it was a beautiful piece of writing. The opening paragraph, however, in the light of later information, strikes me now as ominous. He began with the argument that we whites, from the point of development we had arrived at, must necessarily appear to them, the savages, in the nature of supernatural beings. We approach them with the might as of a deity, and so on and so on. By the simple exercise of our will, we can exert power for a good practically unbounded, etc., etc. From that point, he soared and took me with him. The peroration was magnificent, but difficult to remember, you know. It gave me the notion of an exotic immensity ruled by an august benevolence. It made me tingle with enthusiasm. This was the unbounded power of eloquence, of words, of burning noble words. There were no practical hints to interrupt the magic current of phrases, unless a kind of note at the foot of the last page, scrawled evidently much later in an unsteady hand, may be regarded as an exposition method. It was very simple. At the end of that moving appeal to every altruistic sentiment, it blazed at you, luminous and terrifying, like a flash of lightning in a serene sky. Exterminate all the brutes. Why is this report, prepared for the Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs, so ominous? Why does it frighten Marlow so much? We whites, from the point of development we arrived at, must necessarily appear to them in the nature of supernatural beings. We approach them with the might as of a deity. By the simple exercise of our will, we can exert a power for good practically unbounded. Why does he say this strikes me now as ominous? If you have the power for good practically unbounded, you also have the power for bad practically unbounded. Right? All power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, is the old saying. And so if he has the power of a deity and he has no capacity for faithfulness, no restraint, then there's nothing to stop Kurtz from becoming a monster. And in fact, that's what happens. At the bottom of this, we have his exposition of method. He's writing this report, and he writes in this unsteady hand at the bottom, exterminate all the brutes. So what's his recommendation for the suppression of savage customs? Kill the savages. This is a passage I'd love to talk to. This is where he gets the Harlequin. The Harlequin, he's called the Harlequin because his clothes are patchwork together from a whole bunch of different clothes. The Harlequin tells Marlow that Kurtz was going to shoot me too. And he said, he declared he would shoot me unless I gave him the ivory and then cleared out of the country, because he could do so and had a fancy for it. And there was nothing on earth to prevent it from killing whom he jolly well pleased. It was true, too. I gave him the ivory. Because, of course, now Kurtz he can kill. There's no restraint. They're now approaching the interstation at this point in the story. And he notices as they approach the interstation a weird fence outside of the station with wooden knobs at the top. And as he gets closer, he has an eyeglass, one of those telescopes that they use in pirate movies, right? That long thing. And he's pulling it, he extends it and looks at the station, and he sees round knots. I told you I had been struck at the distance by certain attempts at ornamentation, rather remarkable in the ruinous aspect of the place. Now I had suddenly a nearer view, and the first result was to make me throw my head back as if before a blow. He sees something through the telescope as it magnifies the station, and it shocks him so much that he snaps his head back. Then I went carefully from post to post with my glass and saw my mistake. This is page 115. These round knobs were not ornamental, but symbolic. They were expressive and puzzling, striking and disturbing. Food for thought, and also for the vultures if there had been any looking down from the sky. But at all events, for such ants as were industrious enough to ascend the pole. They would have been even more impressive, these heads on the stakes, if their faces had not been turned to the house. Only one, the first I made out, was facing my way. He sees a bunch of posts with knobs on them. He looks closer and sees their heads on posts. The heads on the post, however, oddly enough, are turned facing the station. You're walking through the woods, you come upon a house, there are a bunch of human heads on posts around the house, you think, this might not be the best place to be right now, and get out of there, right? In order to make them effective, you make the heads face outward so that people see them. These heads are facing inward. It's to keep the people inside under control, and also to remind Kurtz of his power. They're a reminder to Kurtz. So yes, they're not there to keep people away, they're there to keep people in. He describes the skull, and he says, I'm not disclosing any trade secrets. In fact, the manager said afterwards that Mr. Kurtz's methods had ruined the district. We'll look at that passage. I have no opinion on that point, but I want you clearly to understand there's nothing exactly profitable in these heads being there. They only show that Mr. Kurtz lacked restraint in the gratification of his various lusts. There was something wanting in him, some small matter which, when the pressing need arose, could not be found under his magnificent eloquence. Whether he knew of this deficiency himself, I can't say. I think the knowledge came to him at last, only at the very last. But the wilderness had found him out early, and had taken on him a terrible vengeance for the fantastic invasion. I think it had whispered to him things about himself which he did not know, things of which he had no conception till he took counsel with his great solitude, and the whisper proved irresistibly fascinating. It echoed loudly within him because he was hollow at the core. T.S. Eliot writes a poem called The Hollow Men, and that line is the origin of that poem. He has no faith, no capacity for faithfulness. Kurtz, when he is away from civilization and away from the policeman and the butcher and the kind neighbor whispering of public opinion, he has no faithfulness to restrain him. He lacked restraint in the gratification of his various lusts. And so he uses his power for his own gratification. They go ashore, they find Kurtz, he's really sick, they bring him back on board the boat, they put him on the boat, and they're getting ready to leave to take him back the next day. During the night, Marlow gets up, walks through the boat, looks into Kurtz's room, and finds that Kurtz has gone. He has left the boat and gone back to the Africans. I glanced casually into the cabin. This is page 121. A light was burning within, but Mr. Kurtz was not there. I think I would have raised an outcry if I believed my eyes, but I didn't believe them at first. The thing seemed so impossible. The fact was I was completely unnerved by a sheer blank fright, pure abstract terror unconnected with any distinct shape of physical danger. What made this emotion so overpowering was, how shall I define it, the moral shock I received, as if something altogether monstrous, intolerable to thought, and odious to the soul had been thrust upon me unexpectedly. This lasted, of course, the merest fraction of a second, and then the usual sense of commonplace deadly danger, the possibility of sudden onslaught and massacre, or something of the kind which I saw impending, was positively welcome and composing. It pacified me, in fact, so much I did not raise an alarm. What was so horrifying about Kurtz leaving the boat, that the prospect of being slaughtered by savages actually relaxes him. He said, I was so shocked, the moral shock I received was so odious to the soul, that the sense of commonplace deadly danger, the possibility of sudden onslaught and massacre, was something of the kind, was positively welcome and composing. He's been rescued. The Europeans have come on a boat and rescued him, and he chooses to go back to Africa. He can't abandon the power that he has there. He goes on shore, grabs Kurtz. Kurtz resists, but he says that he has to appeal to Kurtz himself. He can't appeal to civilization or anything else. He has to appeal to Kurtz himself, because he says, I wasn't arguing with a lunatic either. Believe it or not, his intelligence was perfectly clear, concentrated as true upon himself with horrible intensity, yet clear. And therein was my only chance, barring, of course, the killing of them there and then, which wasn't so good on account of the unavoidable noise. Because he's out next to the African camp, and if he kills them and Kurtz makes an uproar, the Africans will come and kill Marlow. But his soul was mad. Being alone in the wilderness, it had looked within itself, and by heavens, I tell you, it had gone mad. I had for my sins, I suppose, to go through the ordeal of looking into it itself. He struggled with it himself, too. I saw it. I heard it. I saw the inconceivable mystery of a soul that knew no restraint, no faith, and no fear, yet struggling blindly with itself. Kurtz represents the epitome of European civilization, who, faced with the absolute power, abandons the ideals of civilization. Now, to us, after World War II, and after seeing the savagery that currently civilized humans are capable of, this might not be a shock. But to someone who has grown up in the atmosphere of positivism, it might be a horrifying shock. He gets Kurtz back on board the boat. Kurtz is lying in his room. He comes in. Kurtz says, I'm lying here in the dark waiting for death. The light was within a foot of his eyes. I forced myself to murmur, oh, nonsense, and stood over him as if transfixed. Anything approaching the change that came over his features I had never seen before and never hoped to see again. Oh, I wasn't touched. I was fascinated. It was as though a veil had been rent. I saw in that ivory face the expression of somber pride, of ruthless power, of craven terror, of an intense and hopeless despair. Did he live his life again in every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender during that supreme moment of complete knowledge? He cried and whispered some image at some vision. He cried out twice, a cry that was no more than a breath. The horror. The horror. Now, originally when Conrad wrote this, Kurtz says the horror once, and he revised it to say twice. The argument is that Conrad means him to say the horror twice. One is the condemnation of his own behavior, but the other is the condemnation of civilization. Marlow says, he tells us that he himself got sick. He caught the disease too and was delirious on the way out. But he says he found himself near death also, but he did not believe he could have done what Kurtz did, which is to judge society. And he said, that is the reason why I affirm that Kurtz was a remarkable man. He had something to say. He said it. Since I had peeped over the edge myself, I understand better the meaning of his stare that could not see the flame of the candle, but was wide enough to embrace the whole universe, piercing enough to penetrate all the hearts that beat in the darkness. He had summed up. He had judged. The horror. He was a remarkable man. After all, this was the expression of some sort of belief. It had candor. It had conviction. It had a vibrating note of revolt in its whisper. It had the appalling face of a glimpsed truth, the strange commingling of desire and hate. And then he describes his own sickness, and he says, better his cry, much better. It was an affirmation, a moral victory paid for by innumerable defeats, by abominable terrors, by abominable satisfaction. But it was a victory. That is why I have remained loyal to Kurtz to the last. And even beyond, and a long time after, I heard once more not his own voice, but the echo of his magnificent eloquence thrown at me from the soul, translucently pure as a cleft of crystal. And that's the intended he's talking about. So why is he loyal to Kurtz as opposed to, say, the manager? We skip back really quickly. I want to go back to a passage we skipped over. The manager on page 119 describes Kurtz's behavior. And the manager says, describing Kurtz's methods of getting the ivory, because the method is unsound. Do you, said I, looking at the shore, call it unsound method? Without a doubt, he exclaimed hotly. Don't you? No method at all, I murmured it after a while. Exactly, he exulted. I anticipated this. So it shows a complete want of judgment. It is my duty to point it out of the proper quarter. And then I had never breathed an atmosphere so vile, and I turned mentally to Kurtz for relief, positively for relief. It was something to have at least a choice of nightmares. Why is the manager worse than Kurtz? What's the manager's judgment of Kurtz's behavior? The method is unsound. Kurtz was down here killing all these savages and stealing their gold. Geez, that is such a bad business practice. That's a bad business practice. You know, later on, maybe when we've got to the very end and we're getting ready to get out of here, we can kill them all and take their IP. But right now, there's more effective business management practices. So he condemns it as an unsound method. Kurtz's condemnation is the horror of the horror.
And for that reason, Marlow determines that he is going to pledge his allegiance to Kurtz over the manager. If we look at the bottom of page 125, he says, "This is the reason why I affirm that Kurtz was a remarkable man. He had something to say. He said it. Since I had peeped over the edge myself, I understand better the meaning of his stare that could not see the flame of the candle, but was wide enough to embrace the whole universe, piercing enough to penetrate all the hearts that beat in the darkness. He had summed it up. He had judged. The horror. He was a remarkable man. After all, this was the expression of some sort of belief. It had candor. It had conviction. It had a vibrating note in its whisper, had the appalling face of a glimpsed truth, the strange commingling of desire and hate." And so Marlow determines that, as opposed to the manager who believes that Kurtz's behavior was merely bad business, an unsound method, Kurtz is able to summon up the moral authority to judge civilization as a horror. And so therefore, Marlow goes on to say, "I like to think my summing up would not have been a word of careless contempt. Better his cry, much better. It was an affirmation, a moral victory paid for by innumerable defeats, by abominable terrors, by abominable satisfactions. But it was a victory. That is why I have remained loyal to Kurtz to the last, and even beyond, when a long time after I heard once more, not his own voice, but an echo of his magnificent eloquence thrown to me from a soul as translucently pure as a cliff of crystal." And of course, that soul as translucently pure as a cliff of crystal is the intended soul. And his encounter with the intended is the moral climax of the novel. As we go through this passage, pay very careful attention to the motif of light versus dark and how those two themes are organized within this passage with references to light and darkness. This is the moment in which Marlow recognizes, paradoxically, that the light itself is the source of the darkness. And you'll notice how the darkness is organized around the light of faith within the intended. It starts on page 128, and we'll start when he comes to her door and knocks on her door. "I rang the bell before a mahogany door on the first floor, and while I waited, he seemed to stare at me out of the glassy panel, stare with that wide and immense stare, embracing, condemning, loathing all the universe. I seemed to hear the whispered cry, the horror, the horror. The dusk was falling. I had to wait in a lofty drawing room with 3 long windows from floor to ceiling that were like 3 luminous and bedraped columns. The bent gilt legs and backs of the furniture shone in indistinct curves. The tall marble fireplace had a cold and monumental whiteness. A grand piano stood massively in a corner with dark gleams on the flat surfaces like a somber and polished sarcophagus." At the beginning, remember, he referred to the city in which the intended lives, which is also the headquarters of the company, as the sepulchral city. And of course, a sepulcher is a holy place, but also a funereal place. And this room itself seems to be funereal. It's almost like a funeral parlor. It has luminous and bedraped columns. The tall marble fireplace had a cold and monumental whiteness. Of course, a monument is also a gravestone. A grand piano stood massively in the corner with dark gleams on the flat surfaces like a somber and polished sarcophagus, which is a fancy box containing a corpse. So this room itself is reminiscent of a funeral parlor. And of course, when the intended shows up, she is in mourning. She came forward, all in black, with a pale head floating towards me in the dusk. She was in mourning. It was more than a year since his death, more than a year since the news came. She seemed as though she'd remember and mourn forever. She took both my hands in hers and murmured, "I had heard you were coming." I noticed she was not very young. I mean, not girlish. She had a mature capacity for fidelity, for belief, for suffering. Now remember that at the beginning of the novel, Marlow says that one must have a capacity for faithfulness, an ability to sacrifice, and it's quite clear now that he was referring to the intended after the fact, because she is sacrificing herself out of her fidelity to, faithfulness to Kurtz. She's been in mourning more than a year, and you have to understand that the custom was that if a family member dies, you are supposed to go into mourning for a year, which means for a year you're supposed to wear black clothes and not have any fun. At the end of the year, you can wear lighter clothes or maybe a black armband and start to go out a little bit, and then eventually you can go back to your normal life. But it's been more than a year and she's still in mourning, even though she wasn't actually even married to Kurtz. She was simply his intended. And so she has demonstrated her mature capacity for fidelity, for belief, for suffering. She's the one who sacrifices. And as a result of her capacity for faithfulness, the room seemed to have grown darker. The darkness is growing around her, as if all the sad light of the cloudy evening had taken refuge on her forehead. This fair hair, this pale visage, this pure brow seemed surrounded by an ashy halo from which the dark eyes looked out at me. Their glance was guileless, profound, confident, and trustful. She carried her sorrowful head as though she were proud of that sorrow, as though she would say, I alone know how to mourn for him as he deserves. But while we were still shaking hands, such a look of awful desolation came upon her face that I perceived she was one of those creatures that are not the playthings of time. For her, he had died only yesterday, and by Jove, the impression was so powerful that for me too he seemed to have died only yesterday, nay, this very minute. I saw her and him in the same instant of time, his death and her sorrow. I saw her sorrow in the very moment of his death. Do you understand? I saw them together. I heard them together. Marlow's trying to get his audience to understand that at the same moment he is hearing her profess her faith in and fidelity to Kurtz, he is hearing Kurtz's condemnation of all that she has faith and fidelity for. He's hearing the paradox. He's hearing the contradictory impulses between her faith in civilization and Kurtz's condemnation of that same civilization as the horror of the horror. So if Marlow's description of this scene seems melodramatic, it's because he's trying to get across the conflict within him between his knowledge of what's really going on and her sustained belief in something that doesn't really exist. Let's skip down just a little bit. You knew him well, she murmured after a moment of mourning silence. Intimacy grows quickly out there, I said. I knew him as well as it is possible for one man to know another. And you admired him, she said. It was impossible to know him and not admire him, was it? He was a remarkable man, I said unsteadily. Then before the appealing fixity of her gaze that seemed to watch me for more words on my lips, I went on. It was impossible not to. Love him, she finished eagerly, silencing me into an appalled dumbness. How true, how true. But when you think that no one knew him so well as I had all his noble confidence. I knew him best. You knew him best, I repeated, and perhaps she did. But with every word spoken, the room was growing darker, and only her forehead, smooth and white, remained illumined by the unextinguishable light of belief and love. So as she is professing her faith in Kurtz and the civilization that he represents, Marlow is hearing the condemnation of the horror, and the room, as a result, is growing darker as the darkness coalesces around her. You were his friend, she went on. His friend, she repeated a little louder. You must have been if he had given you this and sent you to me. I feel I can speak to you, and oh, I must speak. I want you who have heard his last words, to know I have been worthy of him. It is not pride. Yes, I am proud to know I understood him better than anyone on earth. He told me so himself, and since his mother died, I have no one to... I listened. The darkness deepened. As she professes her faith, the darkness gets more intense. Who was not his friend who heard him speak once, she was saying. He drew men towards him by what was best in them. She looked at me with intensity. It is the gift of the great, she went on. and the sound of her voice seemed to have the accompaniment of all the other sounds, full of mystery, desolation, and sorrow I have ever heard. The ripple of the river, the sighing of the trees swayed by the wind, the murmurs of crowds, the faint ring of incomprehensible words cried from afar, the whisper of a voice speaking from beyond the threshold of an eternal darkness. "But you have heard him, you know," she cried. "Yes, I know," I said with something like despair in my heart, but bowing my head before the faith that was in her, before the great and saving illusion that shone with an unearthly glow in the darkness, in the triumphant darkness from which I could not have defended her, from which I could not even defend myself. And so as she is expressing her faith, the darkness is growing deeper and more intense around her, as she is clearly, and her faith is clearly, the heart of darkness itself. "What a loss to me, to us," she corrected herself with beautiful generosity, then added in a murmur, "to the world." By the last gleams of twilight, I could see the glitter of her eyes full of tears that would not fall. "I have been very happy, very fortunate, very proud," she went on. "Too fortunate, too happy for a little while. And now I am unhappy for life." She stood up. Her fair hair seemed to catch all the remaining light in a glimmer of gold. I rose too. "And of all this," she went on mournfully, "of all his promise, of all his greatness, of his generous mind, his noble heart, nothing remains, nothing but a memory. You and I, we shall always remember him," I said hastily. "No," she cried, "it's impossible that all this should be lost, that such a life should be sacrificed to leave nothing but sorrow. You know what vast plans he had. I knew of them too. I could not perhaps understand, but others knew of them. Something must remain. His words, at least, have not died." "His words will remain," I said to myself. "And his example," she whispered to herself. "Men looked up to him. His goodness shone in every act. His example." "True," I said. "His example, too. Yes, his example. I forgot that. But I cannot believe, not yet, I cannot believe that I shall never see him again, that nobody will ever see him again. Never, never, never." She put out her arms as if after a retreating figure, stretching them black and with clasped pale hands across the fading and narrow sheen of the window. "Never see him. I saw him clearly enough then. I shall see this eloquent phantom as long as I live, and I shall see her too, a tragic and familiar shade, resembling in this gesture another one, tragic also, bedecked with powerless charms, stretching bare brown arms over the glitter of the infernal stream, the stream of darkness." And of course, Marlow is comparing the intended to Kurtz's African mistress, who also attempted to ward off the Europeans with charms that didn't work. She said, suddenly very low, "He died as he lived." "His end," said I, with dull anger stirring in me, "was in every way worthy of his life." "And I was not with him," she murmured. My anger subsided before a feeling of infinite pity. "Everything that could be done," I mumbled. "Ah, but I believed in him more than anyone on earth, more than his own mother, more than himself. He needed me. Me, I would have treasured every sigh, every word, every sign, every glance." I felt a chill grip on my chest. "Don't," I said in a muffled voice, because the words she would have treasured would have been the words that destroyed her. The horror, the horror. "Forgive me. I have mourned so long in silence. In silence. You were with him to the last? I think of his loneliness, nobody near to understand him as I would have understood, perhaps no one to hear." "To the end," I said shakily. I heard his very last words. I stopped in a fright. And of course he's frightened because now she's going to demand that he repeat the words, which would mean that he has to tell her what Kurtz's final words were. The horror, the horror. "Repeat them," she murmured in a heartbroken tone. I want something to live with." I was on the point of crying at her. "Don't you hear them?" The dusk was repeating them in a persistent whisper all around us, in a whisper that seemed to swell menacingly like the first whisper of a rising wind. "The horror, the horror." "His last word, to live with," she insisted. "Don't you understand? I loved him. I loved him. I loved him." I pulled myself together and spoke slowly. The last word he pronounced was, "Your name." Of course, he lies to her. Of course, this is the lie that Marlow has been building up to through the whole novel. He says there's a hint of mortality in lies, and I laid the ghost of his gifts at last with a lie to remind us that he was building up to this moment, and this is the lie. But ironically, it's also not the lie, because in some way, she is the horror. We don't actually know her name. She's been identified, just as everyone else in the novel beside Marlow, by their title. She's the intended. But her fidelity to the idea of civilization has also been the justification for the imposition of those civilization on the Africans. It's also the source of the heart of darkness. So in some sense, she truly is the horror. She is the basis of the heart of darkness. And so although he lies to her, by not telling her his exact words, in a way that she can't understand, he also tells her the truth. It seemed to me that the house would collapse before I could escape, that the heavens would fall upon my head, but nothing happened. The heavens do not fall for such a trifle. Would they have fallen, I wonder, if I had rendered Kurtz that justice which was his due? Hadn't he said he wanted only justice? But I couldn't. I could not tell her. It would have been too dark altogether. And so Marlow wimps out. Now that leaves us with a big question. Why does he not tell her the truth? Is it to preserve her? Is it to preserve him? Is it to preserve civilization? Is it an act of desperation? Is he afraid that if he tells her the truth, he will destroy the illusion that is justified civilizing the savages, but the civilization will still go on without any justification? At the beginning of the novel, he had told us, before he began his description of his journey, that what saves civilization is the devotion to an idea and a capacity for faithfulness and self-sacrifice. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look at it too much. What redeems it is the idea only, an idea at the back of it, not a sentimental pretense, but an idea and an unselfish belief in the idea, something you can set up and bow down before and offer a sacrifice to. And so perhaps the intended's belief in civilization is the only thing that protects civilization from descending into nihilism. Marlow had said, after leaving his aunts, but clearly thinking ahead of the intended, that the women are out of it, should be out of it. We must help them to stay in that beautiful world of their own, lest ours gets worse. Oh, she had to be out of it. But Marlow's lie is also his failure and is also his sin. And as we talked about at the beginning of this discussion of Heart of Darkness, Marlow is like the ancient mariner who has to atone for his failure by traveling the world and telling a story in order to communicate to others what he has learned from his experiences. And it's important to remember that he is on the boat at the mouth of the Thames with the director of companies, the accountant, the lawyer, the person who's telling the story, and he is trying to communicate to him the meaning that he has derived from his experience, from his journey inward to the heart of darkness. And to some extent, he seems to have been successful. If you look at the last paragraph, Marlow stops speaking, and the narrator who has been repeating Marlow's story picks up. Marlow ceased and sat apart, indistinct and silent, in the pose of a meditating Buddha. Nobody moved for a time. "We have lost the first of the ebb," said the director suddenly. So like the wedding guest who is waiting to go into the wedding in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but becomes transfixed by the mariner's story, the people on the boat who have been waiting for the turn of the tide so they can take the tide up the River Thames have been so caught up in the story that they have missed the turn of the tide. I raised my head. The offing was barred by a blank bank of clouds, and the tranquil waterway leading to the uttermost ends of the earth flowed somber under an overcast sky, seemed to lead into the heart of an immense darkness. And so the narrator, who at the beginning of the story had seen the River Thames in the august light of abiding memories leading off to the wonders and glories of civilization, now sees that same river as leading under a somber sky to an immense darkness.